Goliath, get that wand!
He-Man and the Masters of the Universe is often credited with revolutionizing the world of animated cartoons, and admittedly, the show did change the landscape of toy-based shows and syndicated animation. With Mattel working alongside Filmation to release a parallel toy line and animated series built around a sword and planet fantasy universe, it wasn't long before He-Man toys flooded the market, while Prince Adam's Double Identity and Magical Adventures kept our eyes glued to the screen. Now, its popularity might have you thinking that He-Man stood completely alone at the forefront of the golden age of 80s cartoons. But taking a closer look at classic animated shows made me realize that many earlier cartoons had already laid the groundwork for He-Man's success. Some gave us magical transformations, some gave us barbarian heroes, some gave us split artifacts, sword and sorcery worlds, muscular warriors, sci-fi fantasy planets, animal companions, and secret identities. So without further ado, let me take you through 10 classic cartoons that predate He-Man and helped shape the kind of world that Masters of the Universe would later perfect.
Anna, I'll cover!
No!
1. Blackstar. While one power sword being split into two halves held by opposing forces sounds like the kind of mythology you'd expect from early He-Man lore, a very similar concept appeared in Filmation's 1981 animated series Blackstar. The show was released just a couple of years before He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and from the protagonist's heroic design to the alien fantasy setting, it almost feels like a warm-up act for Eternia. The show focuses on an astronaut named John Blackstar, who finds himself stranded on the strange planet Sagar. There, he allies with the Trobbits, the shape-shifting clone, the warlock Mara, and the enchantress Amber to battle the evil Overlord. Now, the similarities between He-Man's team and Blackstar's found family are just the start. The real connection becomes more obvious when you look at the Overlord's lore. He is introduced as a powerful tyrant who possesses one half of the Power Star. Blackstar has the other half, called the Star Sword. The Overlord wants to reunite both halves and gain full control of that power. That idea naturally reminds fans of early Masters of the Universe mini-comic lore, where the Power Sword was also split into two halves, with He-Man and Skeletor connected to opposite sides of the struggle. Later, the Filmation He-Man cartoon simplified the sword lore, but the similarity between Blackstar and early MOTU mythology is hard to miss. Even the villain setup feels familiar. Overlord rules from a stronghold, commands monsters and minions, and wants the ultimate magical weapon. Replace Sagar with Eternia, Overlord with Skeletor, and the Star Sword with the Power Sword, and you can see why Blackstar is often called a close predecessor to He-Man. The two shows also shared Filmation DNA, including overlapping talent and voice actors. Alan Oppenheimer voiced the Overlord in Blackstar and later became the iconic voice of Skeletor. At the end of the day, Blackstar was not simply a forgotten cartoon. It was one of the clearest stepping stones toward the kind of sci-fi fantasy world that He-Man would soon turn into a phenomenon. 2. Thundarr the Barbarian. While I can somewhat understand He-Man's similarities to Filmation's own older shows, the wider inspiration doesn't stop there. In 1980, Ruby Spears Productions produced Thundarr the Barbarian, a post-apocalyptic animated series created by Steve Gerber. The show introduced a muscular warrior with a mighty, animal-like companion, Ukla the Mock, by his side. That alone takes us right back to He-Man and Battle Cat, but the group's similarities continue with other characters. Princess Ariel is a young sorceress who travels with Thundarr and helps him survive a world ruled by wizards, mutants, and monsters. She's intelligent, magically skilled, and capable of holding her own in battle, which naturally reminds fans of the kind of warrior mystic energy later associated with Teela and the sorceress side of Eternia's mythology. Thundarr's rugged muscular appearance and outfit also place him inside the same barbarian hero tradition that He-Man would later join. His Sun Sword, a powerful energy weapon, adds the perfect sci-fi fantasy touch. It's not just a sword, it's a symbol of heroic power, capable of cutting through the darkness of a ruined world. Now, to be clear, Thundarr himself did not invent the barbarian hero. The show drew heavily from the same older sources that later shaped He-Man, including Conan-style fantasy, sword and sorcery imagery, and sci-fi adventure worlds. But that's exactly what makes this comparison so interesting. Thundarr the Barbarian shows that by 1980, the formula was already forming. A muscular warrior, a magical energy weapon, a dangerous world, sorcerers, monsters, and a mix of ancient fantasy with futuristic science. The show is set in a post-apocalyptic world where ruined cities like New York, Las Vegas, and Washington, D.C. became playgrounds for monsters and wizards. That dystopian spin made it feel ahead of its time, and it gave kids the fantasy that adventure might be hiding inside the broken remains of their own world. So while Thundarr was not simply He-Man before He-Man, it absolutely helped prove that kids were ready for sword and sorcery cartoons that mixed muscle, magic, and sci-fi weirdness. He-Man would take that same energy and turn it into a toy-driven empire. 3. Mighty Mightor. Hanna-Barbera gave us some of our most memorable childhood cartoons, from the Flintstones and Yogi Bear to the Smurfs. But in 1967, the studio also released Moby Dick and Mighty Mightor, a superhero adventure series that included the segment Mighty Mightor. Designed by legendary comic artist Alex Toth, the show followed a teenage caveman named Tor, who transformed into the powerful Mightor by raising his magic club. Yeah, I don't think I need to say much for you to connect the dots with He-Man. A seemingly ordinary young hero raises a magical weapon and transforms into a much stronger heroic entity. That's exactly the kind of transformation ritual that later became central to Prince Adam becoming He-Man. But the similarities go deeper than that. Tor's pet dinosaur, Tog, also transforms. When Tor becomes Mightor, Tog becomes a powerful fire-breathing dragon. That gives us an early version of the hero and pet transformation dynamic that He-Man would later make famous, with Prince Adam and Cringer becoming He-Man and Battle Cat. Back in the original show, Mightor and Tog protected nearby villagers from monsters, villains, and evil forces. Mightor's true identity was also kept secret, which adds another layer of connection to Prince Adam's secret transformation into He-Man. Of course, He-Man's world was much bigger, more toyetic, and more developed, but Mighty Mightor shows that the basic transformation fantasy had already existed in children's animation long before Eternia arrived. You have the young hero, the raised magical object, the stronger alter ego, the animal companion, and the secret identity. If you want to be taken back to an age where low-budget but imaginative animation, bright fantasy worlds, and straightforward adventure plots defined Saturday mornings, this forgotten gem is exactly what you should be tuning into. 4. Young Samson and Goliath. Another classic Hanna-Barbera production, Young Samson and Goliath, was released in 1967 and followed a teenager named Samson and his dog Goliath as they traveled across the country on a motorbike and ran into all kinds of trouble, from supervillains to evil scientists. Now, what makes this show especially important in a He-Man conversation is Samson's transformation. Whenever danger appears, Samson clashes his golden wristbands and transforms into a superhero version of the biblical Samson. Then, with another slam of the wristbands, his dog Goliath transforms into a super-powered lion. Come on, that's almost impossible to ignore. A young man transforms into a powerful heroic form, while his loyal pet transforms into a mighty battle companion. Years later, Prince Adam would raise the Sword of Power and become He-Man, while Cringer would become Battle Cat. The details are different, of course. Samson uses wristbands, not a sword. Goliath becomes a lion, not a giant armored tiger. But the emotional fantasy is the same. A young hero who seems ordinary can suddenly become mighty, and the pet who travels with him can also become a powerful partner. Samson could also direct shockwaves from his wristbands and increase both his and Goliath's powers. so even the artifact-based power system feels familiar. The show gave children a ritual, a catchphrase-like transformation moment, and a fantasy of hidden strength waiting to be unlocked. Many fans have joked that Battle Cat owes at least part of his career to Goliath, and honestly, the comparison makes sense. Young Samson and Goliath was not Eternia, but it carried a lot of the same DNA that would later make He-Man and Battle Cat so instantly appealing. 5. The Mighty Hercules. Steering away from fantasy planets and into Greek mythology, The Mighty Hercules was a 1963 animated series set in a sword and sandal world of gods, monsters, and ancient heroes. The show featured Hercules operating from Mount Olympus and battling villains who threatened the people of ancient Greece. In mythology, Hercules is already a symbol of divine strength and heroic power. But the cartoon takes that ancient figure and gives him a more superhero-like spin. In this version, Hercules uses a magic ring to channel his godlike power. When he raises his fist and calls upon Olympus, lightning strikes, and he gains super strength. That transformation ritual is the important part. A heroic figure raises a magical object, calls upon a higher power, and becomes superhuman. Years later, He-Man would raise the Sword of Power and call upon the power of Grayskull. The wording, the weapon, and the mythology are different, but the structure feels very familiar. This doesn't mean He-Man copied the Mighty Hercules directly. What it means is that children's animation had already established a powerful visual language. Hero raises object, lightning or magical force appears, body becomes empowered, adventure begins. In an era where mythological franchises like Percy Jackson have made Greek stories popular again, many fans forget that older cartoons were already turning ancient heroes into animated action figures long before modern fantasy television. From Zeus and Daedalus references to bright mythological backdrops, The Mighty Hercules showed that children could absolutely connect with legendary heroes when those heroes were presented with energy, clarity, and adventure. And that's exactly the lane He-Man would later dominate.
Ring time, sis! Shazam!
6. Shazzan. Now, I've already talked about characters gaining powers from artifacts and transforming not just themselves, but also their pets into heroic forms. However, Shazzan took the magical artifact idea in a different direction. Shazzan was a 1967 Hanna-Barbera animated series created by Alex Toth. It followed siblings Chuck and Nancy, who discover a chest containing two halves of a magical ring. When they combine the halves, they're transported to a world inspired by the Arabian Nights and meet a giant genie named Shazzan. If this doesn't sound fascinating enough, their journey becomes even more fun when Shazzan creates a magical flying camel named Kabubi and gives the siblings magical gifts such as an invisibility cloak and a magic rope. However, there is a condition. They must return the two halves of the ring to the Wizard of the Seventh Mountain before they can go home. Along the way, the siblings face villains such as the Demon in the Bottle and the Master of Thieves. A frequent problem is that Chuck and Nancy get separated, meaning they cannot combine the ring halves and summon Shazzan until they reunite. So the show repeatedly uses the idea that split magical objects only work when brought together. Now, this doesn't directly prove that Shazzan inspired He-Man, but the trope of two halves of a magical artifact that must be joined to unlock power definitely feels familiar when compared with early Power Sword lore in Masters of the Universe. It's part of the same long tradition of fantasy storytelling where power is incomplete until a divided object becomes whole again. And honestly, even beyond the He-Man comparison, Shazzan is a wonderfully strange cartoon. It has a desert fantasy world, magical artifacts, a genie, flying transportation, and pure Saturday morning adventure energy. If you ever find yourself in the mood for a desert-themed sword and sorcery adventure, Shazzan is the perfect pick.
That's public property, mister. Maybe you'd better calm down a little.
7. The Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam. Moving from Shazzan to Shazam, the Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam was an NBC Saturday morning cartoon that aired in 1981, just a couple of years before He-Man became a television giant. It was also produced by Filmation, which makes the comparison even more interesting. The show featured DC's Captain Marvel, now better known to modern audiences as Shazam, along with members of the Marvel family. Its core transformation idea came from the comics. Young Billy Batson says the magic word Shazam and is transformed by lightning into the adult superhero Captain Marvel. That transformation is one of the clearest predecessors to Prince Adam raising the Sword of Power and becoming He-Man. In both cases, a young or less physically imposing identity is replaced by a powerful, heroic form through a magical phrase and a burst of energy. Now, Captain Marvel existed decades before He-Man, so this trope was already classic by the time Filmation handled Shazam. But because Filmation produced both the Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam and He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, it is worth noting how comfortable the studio already was with transformation-based hero storytelling. The show also had a campy, colorful comic book energy, complete with villains like Dr. Sylvana, Mr. Mind, and Black Adam. Despite its comic-heavy storylines, fans remember it fondly for its theme song, action, humor, and old-school superhero charm. And yes, if He-Man's transformation sometimes feels like a sword and sorcery cousin of Billy Batson's Shazam moment, you are not imagining things. They belong to the same tradition of magical transformation heroes. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. Rewinding to the late 70s, Filmation was known for trying to rise above standard animated fare in certain ways, especially when it came to adapting well-known adventure characters. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, which began in 1976, is a prime example of this. The show depicted Tarzan not as a simple-minded jungle man, but as intelligent, articulate, noble, and heroic, which was closer to Edgar Rice Burroughs' original conception of the character. This version of Tarzan was muscular, agile, honorable, and surrounded by a dangerous wilderness filled with lost cities, ancient threats, and strange civilizations. Now, the strongest He-Man connection here is visual and production-related, rather than story-based. Filmation was known for reusing animation, stock movement, and heroic body poses to keep costs under control. Fans have long noticed that some He-Man movement and body language feel similar to earlier Filmation heroes, including Tarzan. That doesn't mean every He-Man shot was simply stolen from Tarzan, but it does mean Filmation had a recognizable house style that carried forward from one series to another. Tarzan's muscular, bare-limbed, loincloth-wearing heroic look also belongs to the same visual family as He-Man, even if the characters come from very different genres. Tarzan is jungle adventure, He-Man is sword and planet fantasy. But both are built around the fantasy of a physically perfect heroic protector moving through a dangerous world. If you like He-Man, Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle is worth checking out because it shows what Filmation was already doing before Eternia. You can see the studio's approach to heroic anatomy, repeated movement, dramatic poses, and adventure pacing. In that sense, Tarzan isn't simply a comparison point, he is part of Filmation's road toward He-Man. 9. The New Adventures of Flash Gordon. Just like Filmation drew from Tarzan-style heroism, it also had a major sci-fi fantasy predecessor in The New Adventures of Flash Gordon. Released in 1979, this Filmation series was developed partly in response to the massive success of Star Wars, but it was also designed as an homage to Alex Raymond's original Flash Gordon comic strip. The series featured Flash, Dale Arden, and Dr. Hans Zarkov traveling to Mongo, where they battled Ming the Merciless and built alliances with different kingdoms and peoples, including the Lion People, the Hawkmen, and the people of Arborea. This is where the He-Man connection becomes very strong in terms of world building. Mongo is a planet where old-fashioned kingdoms, savage tribes, flying cities, monsters, ray guns, science, and magic-like spectacle all exist together. That's exactly the kind of genre fusion Eternia would later embrace. In He-Man, you can have laser weapons, ancient castles, magic swords, robots, beasts, sorceresses, and barbarians all living inside one world. The New Adventures of Flash Gordon helped prove that this mixture could work in animation. You didn't have to choose between science fiction and fantasy. You could have both. You could have a hero using a sword in one scene and futuristic technology in the next. You could have wizards and spaceships sharing the same universe. Filmation later used that same confidence in He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, where the world of Eternia often felt like Conan, Flash Gordon, Star Wars, and fairy tale fantasy had all been thrown into one blender. So if you're curious about what helped set the tone for He-Man's technologically advanced yet magic-heavy world, The New Adventures of Flash Gordon is definitely something you must check out. 10. The Sword in the Stone. Finally, I'm sure every history and mythology geek out there has heard of Excalibur, the mighty sword associated with King Arthur across countless legends. This concept also played its way into Walt Disney's 1963 musical fantasy film, The Sword in the Stone, which followed young Arthur, also known as Wart, on his path toward becoming the rightful king. In the film, King Uther Pendragon dies without an heir, and a magical sword appears in an anvil set into a stone. The inscription declares that whoever pulls the sword free will become the rightful king of England. Many try and fail, but young Arthur eventually pulls it out, proving his destiny. Now, unlike He-Man, Arthur is not a muscular warrior transforming into a superhero. The comparison here is more mythic than visual. The sword is a symbol of chosen identity. It proves that someone who seems ordinary or underestimated is actually meant for greatness. That idea is very close to the emotional logic behind Prince Adam and the Power Sword. Adam may seem soft, unserious, or unworthy to outsiders, but once he raises the sword and calls upon the power of Grayskull, he reveals the heroic destiny hidden inside him. So yes, He-Man's mythology can be read as an Arthurian idea blended with 80s sci-fi fantasy. You have a chosen hero, a magical sword, a kingdom in need of protection, and a mythic source of power. Add muscle, laser guns, monsters, and a toy-friendly world, and you get Eternia. If you enjoy a good history lesson with charming animation and adventurous backdrops, Disney's The Sword in the Stone is definitely worth revisiting. From Blackstar's split-weapon mythology to Hanna-Barbera's teenager-turned-hero concepts in Mighty Mightor and the young Samson and Goliath, I was shocked to discover just how many earlier cartoons anticipated the ideas that He-Man later made iconic. Now, to be fair, He-Man was not just a copy of these shows. It took familiar ingredients from mythology, superhero cartoons, sword and sorcery stories, sci-fi adventure, and toy line marketing, then fused them into something perfectly timed for the 1980s. That fusion is what made Masters of the Universe special. So yes, earlier cartoons walked so He-Man could run across Eternia with a sword in the air. But He-Man still deserves credit for turning those older ideas into one of the most iconic action-adventure cartoons ever made. Well, that's all from me. I'd love to know what you think in the comments below.